So correct me if I'm wrong, but in your book Selfish Gene, the gene-centered view of evolution allows us to think of the physical organisms as just the medium through which the software of our genetics and the ideas sort of propagate. Uh, so maybe can we start just with the basics? What in this context does the word meme mean?
It would mean the cultural equivalent of a gene, cultural equivalent in the sense of that which plays the same role as the gene in the transmission of culture, in the transmission of ideas in the broadest sense. And it's only a useful word if there's something Darwinian going on. Obviously, culture is transmitted, but is there anything Darwinian going on? And if there is, that means there has to be something like a gene, which becomes more numerous or less numerous in the population.
So it can replicate.
It can replicate. Well, it clearly does replicate. There's no question about that. The question is, does it replicate in a sort of differential way in a Darwinian fashion? Could you say that certain ideas propagate because they're successful in the meme pool? In a sort of trivial sense, you can. Would you wish to say, though, that in the same way as an animal body is modified, adapted to serve as a machine for propagating genes, is it also a machine for propagating memes? Could you actually say that something about the way a human is modified, adapted for the function of meme propagation?
That's such a fascinating possibility, if that's true. If that it's not just about the genes, which seems somehow more comprehensible as like these things of biology. The idea that culture, or maybe ideas, you can really broadly define it.
Yes,
operates under these mechanisms.
Even morphology, even anatomy, it does evolve by mimetic means. I mean, things like hairstyles, styles of makeup, circumcision. These things are actual changes in the body form.
Yes.
Which are non-genetic and which get passed on from generation to generation, or sideways like a virus, yes. In a quasi-genetic way.
But the moment you start drifting away from the physical, it becomes interesting because the space of ideas, ideologies, political systems.
Of course, yes.
So what's your sense? Are memes a metaphor more, or are they really, is there something fundamental, almost physical presence of memes?
Well, I think they're a bit more than a metaphor, and I think that I mentioned that physical bodily characteristics, which are a bit trivial in a way, but when things like the propagation of religious ideas, both longitudinally down generations and transversely, as in a sort of epidemiology of ideas, when a charismatic preacher converts people, that resembles viral transmission, whereas the longitudinal transmission from grandparent to parent to child, etc., is more like conventional genetic transmission.
That's such a beautiful, especially in the modern day idea. Do you think about this implication in social networks, where the propagation of ideas, the viral propagation of ideas, and hence the new use of the word meme to describe?
Well, the internet, of course, provides extremely rapid method of transmission. And before, when I first coined the word, the internet didn't exist, and so that I was thinking then in terms of books, newspapers, broadband radio, television, that kind of thing. Now, an idea can just leap around the world in all directions instantly. And so the internet provides a step change in the facility of propagation of memes.
How does that make you feel? Isn't it fascinating that sort of ideas, it's like you have Galapagos Islands or something, is the 70s, and the internet allowed all these species to just like globalize. And in a matter of seconds, you can spread a message to millions of people. And these ideas, these memes can breed, can evolve, can mutate. There's a selection, and there's like different, I guess, groups that evolve. Like there's a dynamics that's fascinating here. Do you think?
Yes.
Basically, do you think your work in this direction, while fundamentally was focused on life on Earth, do you think it should continue, like to be taken
yes,
further?
I do think it would probably be a good idea to think in a Darwinian way about this sort of thing. We conventionally think of the transmission of ideas from in evolutionary context as being limited to, in our ancestors, people living in villages, living in small bands where everybody knew each other and ideas could propagate within the village, and they might hop to a neighboring village occasionally and maybe even to a neighboring continent eventually. And that was a slow process. Nowadays, villages are international. I mean, you have people, it's been called echo chambers, where people are in a sort of internet village, where the other members of the village may be geographically distributed all over the world, but they just happen to be interested in the same things, use the same terminology, the same jargon, have the same enthusiasm. So people like the Flat Earth Society, they don't all live in one place. They find each other and they talk the same language to each other. They talk the same nonsense to each other. So this is a kind of distributed version of the primitive idea of people living in villages and propagating their ideas in a local way.
Yes, culture evolves, but not by having another replicator.
Mm-hmm. So that's the issue here, right? The fact that perhaps some people don't agree with us calling a unit of culture, let's say. I don't know if even talking about a unit of culture is the most correct thing to do here, because I mean, what are we really talking about here when we talk about a unit of culture? Because that's really hard to define, and I guess that even when I talked with doctors Boyd and Richardson, I mean, at a certain point I asked them what would be the unit of culture that they would consider, and it's really hard to define, right?
Yes, and I think this is a red herring. I think this whole argument about units comes about because in language, it's much easier to talk about a meme as a unit, but they don't naturally fall into units, but they're not a genes. I mean, you can snip out a gene and say this is responsible for this protein, but, you know, genes can be looked at in lots of different ways, as can memes. So if you think of a unit, I mean, to take the most famous example, people talk about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. You know, what's the unit? Well, I would say, and Dan Dennett, the philosopher, would say also, well, it depends what's passed on. Where the na, 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 becomes part of an advert, you know, that's the unit. But where you give somebody a CD with the thing on, or you download it from somewhere, you'll download the entire symphony, that's the unit. It's not a problem. Don't worry about it. Is my answer.
What do you make of the whole meme theory and the fact that Sue does feel ultimately...
I think it's a shallow derivation of the idea of archetype, and that Dawkins would do well to read some Jung. In fact, if he thought farther and wasn't as blinded by his a priori stance about religion, he would have found that the deeper explanation of meme is in fact archetype.
I disagree. I mean,
Can you just first of all explain archetype for those who are not perhaps familiar with that particular psychological
Well, an archetype
term?
is partly a pattern of behavior that's grounded in biology. So it's the behavior itself. So you could think about that as both the instinct and the manifestation of that instinct, but it's also the representation of that pattern. So part of what's coded in our mythological stories, for example, are images of typical patterns of behavior. And those are the typical patterns of behavior that make us human. I really want to have this discussion about memes, by the way, because it's really a discussion that needs to be had. Because I think that the meme idea is very interesting, and I do think that there are contagious ideas, but that needs to be chased down much deeper, because there are ideas that are so contagious that we've actually adapted to them biologically. And once that happens, they're no longer merely memes. They're something else. They're built into us. Okay, so now we also know that your position in a dominance hierarchy, especially if you're male, is proportionate to your reproductive success. The higher you up in the hierarchy, the more likely you are to succeed. Okay, so what that means is that males have been selected for their ability to move up a dominance hierarchy, but that's not quite right. They've been selected for their ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies. And that's a very abstract set. And there's a set of characteristics that go along with the ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies that's represented in religious terms as the optimal ethical manner in which to conduct yourself.
I see.
And that's not a meme that's casually passed from person to person. It's way deeper than that.
I think you're being unfair to memes. I would make this response here about the difference between memes and archetypes. So archetypes are there whether we have memes or not. All of that history of evolution is there.
Yes.
So we have, ideas about sex differences or ideas about dominance is a very good example that don't require memes. They can then become memes. And a meme by definition, as Dawkins started it out, is that which is imitated, or that which is copied from person to person. So the idea of dominance hierarchies can be a meme, and all the ideas we build on top of that, as long as we pass it from person to person. Now,
we could certainly think of hierarchies of memes from
yes, indeed,
from ones that are no more than fads that wash across the culture to ones that are permanent. But you were kind of
trivializing memes, and I think the power of the idea of memes is this: we have the first replicator genes on the planet, and we know the consequences of that, producing all these organisms. But the idea about memes is that they are a second replicator. So genes are copied by chemical processes in bodies. Memes are copied by imitation and other kinds of interactions between human beings, and very little in any other species at all. And that's what gives rise to culture. So the whole theory about memes is one of many ways of trying to understand the evolution of culture. And in that way, I say it's not trivial
quick
at all.
Response, and I want to move on to talking about the 12 rules, Jordan.
Well, the issue is what happens when a meme is so widely distributed that it becomes a determining factor in evolution itself. Because it translates
meme-gene co-interaction.
Yes, exactly. Well, see, that's where I think the religious, for me, that's the grounds of the essential religious instinct. It's a meme gene interaction, and it goes back forever.
Yes.
And I'll finish with this. See, because once you see that there's a meme gene interaction and that there's selection in favor of a certain meme, let's say, then you open up the entire question of what constitutes the underlying reality. Because
Indeed.
you see, this is something I tried to have a talk with about Sam Harris, and we augured in very rapidly. You could say that reality is that which selects. Now, it's not exactly a materialist viewpoint. It's more of an evolutionary viewpoint. And if reality is that which selects, then what's selected by that reality is in some sense correct. Now, that's not, this is why
Memes are like viruses. That's what Richard said back in '93. And you might think, well, how can that be? I mean, a virus is it's stuff. What's a meme made of? Yesterday, Negroponte was talking about viral telecommunication. But what's a virus? A virus is a string of nucleic acid with attitude. That is, there's something about it that tends to make it replicate better than the competition does. And that's what a meme is an information packet with attitude. What's a meme made of? What are bits made of, Mom? Not silicon. They're made of information. Can be carried in any physical medium. What's a word made of? Sometimes when people say, do memes exist? I say, well, do words exist? Are they in your ontology? If they are, words are memes that can be pronounced. Then there's all the other memes that can't be pronounced. They're different species of memes.
Cold virus isn't for anything except for making more copies of the cold virus, and early memes were just like that. But eventually, competition for utility arose, and now memes, whether they were words or other ways of doing things that actually were of benefit, would spread differentially because they were better ways of doing things that could be not even recognized. It's just that those who adopted them fared better than those who didn't. And before you know it, you have competitive differential replication of cultural items